The thermometer read -54 degrees, and inside Gareth Llewellyn's Elk-Hide Tipi, his daughter slept without shivering while families froze to death in log cabins 3 miles away. What he built in the 2 years since his partner's death would prove that the most advanced shelter on the Dakota frontier wasn't made of notched logs and iron nails, but of animal hide and indigenous engineering that white settlers had dismissed as primitive. Before we begin, let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and if stories of frontier innovation move you, subscribe because tomorrow's tale is even more impossible than this one. Gareth Llewellyn woke to absolute silence. Not the peaceful quiet of a calm winter morning, but the oppressive stillness that came when air itself became too cold to carry sound. He didn't need to check the thermometer outside to know the temperature had dropped into ranges that killed careless men. He had felt this kind of cold only twice before in his 4 years on the Dakota frontier, and one of those times had cost Owen Griffiths his life. He lay still for a moment beneath buffalo robes and wool blankets, listening. The fire in the center pit had burned down to coals during the night, exactly as intended. Above him, the conical ceiling of the teepee rose 15 feet to the smoke hole at the apex, where the lodge poles crossed. Condensation that would have frozen into killing ice in a log cabin had instead risen with the warm air and escaped through the ventilation system he had engineered into the smoke flaps. The temperature inside the teepee hovered somewhere near 40 degrees, cold enough to see breath, but warm enough to sustain life without constant fire tending. Beside him, Bronwyn still slept, her breathing steady and unlabored. On the far side of the fire pit, their daughter Rhiannon lay curled beneath her own pile of furs, her small face peaceful. Gareth felt the familiar wave of relief that came each morning during deep winter. They had survived another night. In a frontier settlement where survival was never guaranteed, that simple fact carried weight. He rose quietly and added wood to the coals, careful pieces of ash and cottonwood he had split and stored inside the teepee weeks earlier. The wood was dry and room temperature, not frozen solid like firewood stored outside a cabin would be. It caught quickly, and within minutes flames rose in a controlled column toward the smoke hole. The teepee's engineering directed the smoke upward while keeping the heat low where people lived. It was a principle he had spent months understanding and years refining. Through the entrance flap, he could see the first gray light of dawn. The leather door covering, 2 layers of elk hide with a wool blanket sandwiched between, had remained flexible throughout the night. Frost coated its exterior surface, but the layered insulation had prevented the cold from penetrating inward. He pulled on his boots, wrapped a wool coat around his shoulders, and stepped outside into air so cold it felt like breathing knives. The settlement spread across the valley below his elevated position. Smoke rose from most chimneys, some in the thick gray columns that meant families were burning everything they could to stay warm. From the Morrison cabin a half-mile south, no smoke rose at all. Gareth stared at that silent chimney for a long moment, then turned back to his teepee where his family slept warm and felt the familiar mix of gratitude and grief that had driven every decision he had made since February of 1865. Gareth Llewellyn had arrived in Dakota Territory in the spring of 1863 with a wagon, 2 horses, basic supplies, and no clear plan beyond heading west. He was 28 years old, the son of a Welsh coal miner who had immigrated to Pennsylvania when Gareth was 12. He had worked in the mines until his father's death in 1861, then sold everything and left the darkness underground for the open sky of the frontier. He met Owen Griffiths in Fort Pierre, a bustling trading post where trappers, soldiers, traders, and indigenous peoples conducted business in a chaos of languages and commerce. Owen was 10 years older, a veteran trapper who had been working the Missouri River tributaries since 1854. He spoke with the thick accent of his native Cornwall, though he had been in America longer than Gareth. They recognized something in each other, that particular brand of Celtic stubbornness that thrived on difficult work and minimal company. Owen needed a partner. Trapping was dangerous alone and more profitable with two men working together. Gareth needed knowledge. He knew nothing about surviving in this landscape, nothing about reading weather or tracking game or identifying safe water. The partnership formed naturally over whiskey and conversation in a Fort Pierre trading room that smelled of wood smoke and animal pelts. They worked well together. Owen taught Gareth how to read the prairie, how to predict storms by watching the behavior of birds and the color of the sky. He showed him how to set beaver traps, how to process pelts, how to cache supplies against theft and weather. Gareth learned quickly and worked tirelessly. By the end of their first season together, they had accumulated enough furs to make a decent profit. In the fall of 1863, they built a cabin near the confluence of two creeks in what would later become the southeastern corner of Dakota Territory. The cabin was standard frontier construction. They selected a site with good water access and timber nearby. They cut logs, notched them at the corners, stacked them into walls. They chinked the gaps with mud and moss. They built a simple door, a stone fireplace, a roof of poles and sod. The entire structure took them 6 days to complete. It was adequate. The cabin kept out wind and rain. The fireplace drew properly and heated the single room to tolerable temperatures during the moderate cold of that first winter. They spent the cold months inside, playing cards, maintaining equipment, and planning the next season's trap lines. When spring came in 1864, they emerged and went back to work. They trapped together for 2 full seasons. Gareth came to consider Owen not just a partner, but a friend, perhaps the closest friend he had ever had. They shared the peculiar intimacy of men who depended on each other for survival in an environment that showed no mercy to mistakes. That friendship made what happened in February of 1865 even harder to bear. February 18, 1865 began as an unremarkable winter day. Cold, but not dangerously so. Gareth and Owen had been checking trap lines along the eastern creek, working systematically through the sets they had placed weeks earlier. They had caught 3 beaver that morning, good quality pelts that would bring fair prices when they traveled to Fort Pierre in the spring. Around midday the wind shifted. Owen noticed it first, stopping mid-sentence in a conversation about whether to extend their trapline north. He turned his face into the breeze, his expression changing from casual to concerned in seconds. Gareth had learned to read Owen's reactions to weather. When the older man looked worried, there was reason to worry. The temperature dropped fast. Within an hour, the wind had strengthened into a steady gale blowing from the northwest. Snow began falling, not the lazy fat flakes of a normal snowfall, but small hard pellets driven horizontal by wind. Visibility decreased rapidly. They abandoned the trap line and headed back toward the cabin, moving as quickly as the deepening snow allowed. They made it to the cabin just as the blizzard reached full force. Inside, they barred the door and built up the fire. The wind howled outside with a sound like sustained screaming. Snow found every gap in the chinking, sifting through in fine streams that accumulated in small drifts along the base of the walls. They stuffed rags and spare clothing into the worst gaps, trying to seal the cabin against the penetrating cold. As night fell, the temperature plummeted. The fireplace roared with a fire hot enough to make the stones glow, but the heat seemed to vanish into the walls and roof. Cold seeped through the logs despite the fire's intensity. They piled on every blanket they owned and huddled close to the flames. Owen started shivering around midnight. Deep, uncontrollable shaking that he couldn't stop despite being wrapped in furs and sitting 2 feet from the fire. Gareth added more wood, building the fire so large that sparks flew up the chimney and the heat was almost unbearable on his face, but his back remained cold. The cabin's construction couldn't hold heat against this level of cold. By dawn, Owen had stopped shivering. That was worse. Gareth knew enough to recognize the danger. when a man stopped shivering in extreme cold. His body was shutting down. He tried to rouse Owen, tried to get him to move, to drink warm water, to stay conscious. Nothing worked. Owen Griffiths died 2 hours after sunrise on February 19, 1865, sitting 3 feet from a roaring fire inside a cabin with walls and a roof. He froze to death because the shelter they had built, using every standard frontier technique, couldn't protect him against extreme cold. Gareth buried Owen on a hillside above the creek when the blizzard finally broke 3 days later. He dug through frozen earth with a pickaxe, working for hours to create a grave deep enough. He wrapped Owen's body in blankets, lowered it into the ground, and covered it with soil and rocks. He spoke no words over the grave. He wasn't a religious man, and Owen hadn't been either. The work itself was the only tribute that mattered. He returned to the cabin and sat alone for a week, unable to process what had happened. The logic didn't align. They had done everything correctly. They had built a solid cabin with good chinking and a proper fireplace. They had stockpiled firewood. They had maintained a massive fire throughout the night. Owen had been healthy and strong. Everything had been done right, and Owen had died anyway. The question formed slowly, but once it took shape, Gareth couldn't dismiss it. If a man could freeze to death inside a cabin with a roaring fire, what was the point of the cabin? The frontier assumption was that shelter meant safety. Log walls and a roof equaled protection from the elements. But Owen's death proved that assumption was incomplete, possibly wrong. Gareth began paying attention to things he had previously ignored. He noticed that during extreme cold, the Lakota camps 20 miles west didn't disappear. The people didn't freeze in their tipis. They continued living, moving, surviving in the same conditions that had killed Owen inside a structure that white settlers considered superior. That observation created a dissonance he couldn't resolve through the standard frontier worldview. In March, he rode to Fort Pierre to report Owen's death and settle the partnership's business affairs. He sold their accumulated furs and divided the proceeds, keeping half and arranging for the other half to be sent to Owen's sister in Missouri. While in Fort Pierre, he asked questions that made other trappers uncomfortable. How did the Indians survive the winter? What made their shelters work? Why didn't they build cabins? The responses were dismissive. Indians were savages who didn't know better. Their tipis were primitive. If they had the knowledge and tools to build proper cabins, they would. The fact that they didn't was evidence of their inferior understanding. Gareth listened to these explanations and found them unconvincing. He had seen Owen die in a proper cabin. He had never heard of entire Lakota camps freezing to death in their tipis. He returned to his cabin in early April and spent the spring trapping alone. The work was harder without a partner, less profitable, more dangerous. But he continued because he needed time to think, to observe, to understand what he had witnessed. Spring gave way to summer in 1865, and Gareth's trapping work became secondary to a different kind of education. He began riding out to observe the Lakota camps that moved across the territory following game and seasonal patterns. He kept his distance, watching through a spyglass from hillsides and tree lines, careful not to intrude or threaten. He was studying engineering, not people, and he had no desire to create conflict. The tipis fascinated him. From a distance, they appeared simple, almost crude. Conical structures of poles and hide that could be assembled or disassembled in hours. But as Gareth watched families erect and occupy these shelters, he began noticing details that suggested sophisticated design rather than primitive simplicity. The poles weren't random sticks, but carefully selected and shaped pieces of specific lengths. The hides weren't thrown haphazardly over frames, but positioned with precision and tied at exact points. He noticed the smoke holes at the apex of each tipi and the adjustable flaps that controlled them. On calm days, the flaps opened wide. When wind picked up, they adjusted to different angles. The adjustment wasn't random. Someone was managing ventilation, based on wind direction and fire needs. That suggested an understanding of air flow and pressure that Gareth hadn't expected. The size variations interested him, small tipis for individuals or couples, larger ones for families, massive structures for gatherings, but the proportions remained consistent. The relationship between base diameter, pole length, and apex height followed a pattern. Gareth started sketching what he observed, trying to work out the mathematical relationships. He had limited formal education, but he understood proportions from his years doing carpentry work. In July, he encountered a mixed-blood trader named Paul Renaud at Fort Pierre. Renaud's mother was Lakota, his father French, and he moved between both worlds with ease. Gareth bought him drinks and asked careful questions. Not about Indian customs or beliefs, which might have seemed intrusive, but about practical construction details. Why that pole angle? Why that specific hide preparation method? What materials worked best? Renaud answered freely. There was no secret knowledge being protected, just practical engineering developed over generations. The poles needed to be straight and strong, usually lodgepole pine. The angle created structural stability while maximizing interior space. Hides needed to be processed to remain flexible in cold weather, which required specific scraping and smoking techniques. The double-wall liner system created dead airspace for insulation. Every element served multiple purposes. Gareth filled a notebook with observations and explanations. He sketched pole configurations, noted hide counts for different size structures, recorded processing techniques. Other trappers who saw him working on these drawings asked what he was planning. He gave vague answers about curiosity and past time. The truth was more specific. He was planning to build a teepee, not as an experiment or cultural gesture, but as a superior shelter solution based on engineering principles he now understood. He just wasn't ready to face the mockery that announcement would bring. By late summer of 1865, Gareth had moved beyond observation to analysis. He understood how tipis functioned, but he needed to understand why specific materials were chosen. The standard tipi covering was buffalo hide, which made sense across most of the plains where buffalo were abundant. But in the wooded valleys and foothills where Gareth operated, buffalo were scarce. Elk were plentiful. He began studying elk hides with the same intensity he had studied tipi construction. He acquired several hides through hunting and examined their properties. Elk hide was thicker than deer, but more flexible than buffalo. The thickness ranged from an 1/8 inch to nearly a 1/4 inch, depending on the animal's age and the hide's location on the body. That thickness mattered. Thicker hide meant better insulation, but also more weight and less flexibility. The natural oil content was significant. Elk hide, properly processed, retained oils that kept the leather supple even in cold temperatures. Gareth tested this by leaving processed elk hide samples outside during cool September nights. In the morning, while dew had frozen on grass and wood, the elk hide remained pliable. The oil content prevented moisture absorption and subsequent freezing. That property would be critical during extreme cold, when moisture management meant the difference between functional shelter and frozen brittleness. Weight calculations occupied several pages of his notebook. A standard buffalo hide tipi covering for a family-sized structure required 12 to 14 hides and weighed approximately 300 pounds when dry. Elk hides were slightly lighter individually. Gareth estimated he would need 15 to 18 elk hides to cover the same area, given their smaller size. The total weight would be similar, around 300 to 350 pounds. Heavy but manageable, and more importantly, obtainable in his region without extensive travel. The processing requirements were different from buffalo. Elk hide needed more aggressive scraping to remove the thicker grain layer, but the smoking process was similar. Gareth had watched Indigenous women processing hides and had learned the basic techniques from Renaud. He would need to adapt those methods to working alone, which would be slower, but not impossible. Structural strength was another consideration. Gareth cut test strips from elk hide and tested their tear resistance. The hide was remarkably strong along the grain, resistant to tearing even under substantial force. Across the grain, it was less resistant but still tougher than he had expected. The hide's fibrous structure gave it properties similar to woven fabric, distributing stress across multiple connection points rather than concentrating it at single failure points. By October, Gareth had reached a conclusion. Elk hide would work. It might even be superior to buffalo hide for his specific situation. The thickness provided excellent insulation. The oil content ensured flexibility in cold. The availability meant he could gather materials without long expeditions. The only question remaining was whether he had the skill to process enough hides and construct a teepee that would actually protect him through a Dakota winter. There was only one way to find that answer. October through December of 1865 became a focused campaign of material acquisition. Gareth needed elk, and he needed them in numbers that would raise questions if anyone paid attention to his hunting patterns. He worked carefully, taking animals from different locations across a wide territory, never depleting any single area enough to be noticed. By early December, he had harvested 19 elk, selected specifically for hide quality. The processing work was brutal. Gareth had no help, no experienced hands to guide him through the tedious scraping and stretching. He worked alone in a crude processing shelter he built near the cabin, a simple frame structure open on one side. Each hide required days of labor. First came the fleshing, scraping away fat and tissue from the inner surface, using a sharpened elk leg bone shaped into a tool. The work left his hands raw and his shoulders aching. After fleshing came the brain tanning process. Gareth mixed elk brains with water to create a slurry, then worked this mixture into the hide fibers. The brains contained oils and enzymes that broke down the hide structure and made it soft. He had observed this process but had never performed it himself. His first 3 hides came out stiff and partially tanned, failures that taught him to work the mixture more thoroughly into every section of leather. The smoking came last. Gareth built a small smoke lodge using green willow branches bent into a dome frame and covered with old canvas. He hung hides inside and burned rotten wood that produced thick smoke without flame. The smoke needed to penetrate completely, giving the hide its characteristic tan color and waterproof properties. Too little smoke meant the hide would stiffen when wet. Too much could make it brittle. He learned by ruining 2 more hides before finding the right balance. By January of 1866, he had 14 usable elk hides. Not perfect, but functional. He had also ruined 5 hides through processing errors, which meant he needed to hunt 4 more elk to reach his target of 18 hides. The winter. Hunting was harder, but he managed it through February, taking animals carefully and processing their hides in the frigid air of his processing shelter. The poles required a different kind of effort. He needed 21 poles, each approximately 20 feet long, straight, and strong enough to support the weight of hide covering plus wind load. Lodge pole pine was ideal, but scarce in his immediate area. He traveled 3 days north to a creek valley where the right trees grew and spent 2 weeks cutting, trimming, and shaping poles. He transported them back in 3 trips using a travois rig pulled by his horse. Additional materials accumulated slowly: sinew for sewing, gathered from elk backstraps, and dried into strong cordage. Wooden pegs whittled from oak branches during evening hours, a large piece of canvas acquired from a trader destined to become the inner liner, tools he already owned or could make. By March of 1866, everything was ready. March of 1866 was still cold, but the worst of winter had passed. Gareth selected a construction site with the same care he had used for material selection. He chose elevated ground 50 yards from the creek, a slight rise that provided drainage and visibility. The location was defensible, not that he expected attack, but visibility mattered for weather observation and game spotting. The ground was level enough to support a circular structure without major excavation. He began with the tripod, the critical foundation of Tipi engineering. 3 poles bound together at the top and spread at the base created the initial framework. The binding point needed to be exactly right. Too loose, and the structure would sway dangerously in wind. Too tight, and the poles couldn't spread to the proper angle. Gareth used the technique he had observed, wrapping strong rope in a specific pattern that allowed adjustment while maintaining security. Once the tripod stood stable, he added the remaining 18 poles, laying them into the tripod's apex framework in a pattern that distributed weight evenly. The poles formed a cone shape approximately 16 feet in diameter at the base and rising 20 feet to the apex. The angle wasn't arbitrary. Gareth had calculated it based on observations and sketches. Too steep and the interior space became unusable. Too shallow and the structure lost strength and smoke, ventilation failed. The hide covering came next, and this was where Gareth's lack of experience showed most clearly. He had sewn the 18 elk hides together over the previous month, creating a massive semicircular covering that would wrap around the pole framework. The sewing used elk sinew thread and a pattern of overlapping seams that he had copied from diagrams in his notebook. The finished covering weighed nearly 300 pounds. Raising the covering required a technique Gareth had to devise himself. Traditional raising used a lifting pole and multiple people. Working alone, he rigged a pulley system using rope and a high branch on a nearby tree. He attached the covering to the rope, hoisted it into position, then carefully wrapped it around the pole framework. The process took an entire day and resulted in several adjustments before the covering sat correctly. The smoke flaps were critical components he had studied extensively. 2 triangular pieces of hide extended above the main covering, attached to poles that could be moved from inside the tipi to adjust the smoke hole opening. Gareth positioned these flaps carefully, ensuring they could pivot properly and that their size matched the diameter of the smoke hole. The relationship between fire size, interior volume, and smoke hole dimension was mathematically specific. Too small a hole, and smoke would accumulate inside. Too large, and heat would escape too rapidly. The door opening faced east, away from prevailing winds. Gareth cut an oval doorway in the hide covering and reinforced its edges with additional strips of leather to prevent tearing. He would build a proper door later, but for now, he hung a heavy blanket as a temporary covering. By sunset, the basic structure stood complete. Gareth walked around it slowly, examining the pole angles, checking the hide tension, testing the stability of the overall framework. It looked authentic, almost identical to the Dakota tipis he had observed. Whether it would actually function as shelter remained to be proven. The exterior structure was only half the engineering. The interior required equal attention to detail, and this was where Gareth's understanding of heat physics became critical. He began with the fire pit, positioning it not at the exact center of the tipi, but slightly toward the back wall. This offset placement served multiple purposes. It created more usable floor space near the entrance and improved the smoke draw by positioning the fire directly beneath the smoke hole's natural draft pattern. He excavated the fire pit carefully, digging down 8 inches and creating a circular depression 18 inches in diameter. The removed earth he used to build a low rim around the pit's edge, containing ash and preventing coals from rolling onto the floor. He lined the bottom with flat stones gathered from the creek, creating a heat-retaining base that would radiate warmth for hours after the fire burned down. The inner liner was perhaps the most important element, though it would be invisible to anyone who didn't understand the engineering. Gareth hung his canvas liner around the interior perimeter, suspended from the lodge poles and extending from ground level to approximately 6 feet high. The liner didn't touch the outer hide covering. A 4-inch gap existed between the 2 layers, creating a dead air space that functioned as insulation. The physics were elegant. Cold air entering at the bottom of the outer covering would be trapped in the gap between liner and outer hide. As warm air from the fire rose, it created circulation that pulled cold air upward through this gap and out the smoke hole, while the liner prevented that cold air from entering the living space. The system created a convective loop that continuously removed cold air while keeping warm air inside where people lived. Ground insulation required equal attention. Gareth covered the entire floor with a thick layer of dried prairie grass compressed into a mat approximately 4 inches deep. Over this he laid buffalo robes, fur side up, creating a sleeping and living surface that prevented heat loss through the ground. The combination of grass and fur created an insulating barrier that was remarkably effective. He had tested the principle by lying on the layered materials during cold nights. The difference between insulated and bare ground was the difference between sleep and misery. He positioned the sleeping area along the back wall opposite the door. This placement took advantage of the teepee's natural heat stratification. Warm air accumulated toward the back and top of the structure, making the back wall the warmest location. The door area, where cold air entered during comings and goings, remained the coolest section. By sleeping in the warmest zone, Gareth maximized comfort while minimizing fuel consumption. Storage areas went along the sides, utilizing space between the liner and the outer wall. He built low platforms using small logs and rawhide lashing, creating surfaces that kept supplies off the ground and away from any moisture that might accumulate. His food supplies, ammunition, tools, and extra furs all found designated positions that kept them accessible while maximizing living space. The final element was aesthetic, but it served a psychological purpose. Gareth hung 2 oil lamps from the lodge poles, positioned to provide light for evening work. The warm glow against the tan hide created an atmosphere that felt welcoming rather than primitive. He was building a home, not just a shelter, and these details mattered. Gareth knew the basic teepee design was sound, proven by generations of use across the plains, but he also knew his situation was unique. He was a single man who would eventually bring a family to this shelter, living in a region where white settlement meant potential hostility from multiple directions. He needed security features that traditional teepees didn't incorporate, adaptations that combined frontier, defensive thinking with indigenous engineering. The door was his first hybrid innovation. Traditional teepee doors were simple hide flaps that could be pinned closed from inside but offered minimal security. Gareth built something more substantial. He created a wooden frame using oak planks, oval-shaped to match the door opening, with 2 layers of elk hide stretched over it and a wool blanket sandwiched between. The frame was rigid enough to stand on its own, but light enough to move easily. He attached the door frame using a hinge system adapted from cabin. Construction. Leather straps reinforced with iron rings allowed the door to swing outward while remaining removable if needed. From inside, he could bar the door using a heavy wooden beam that dropped into brackets attached to the nearest lodge poles. The system wouldn't stop a determined assault, but it would prevent casual entry and provide warning of any attempt to force entrance. Around the base of the teepee, Gareth added an innovation he had never seen in traditional construction. He created a skirt using additional elk hide, extending 18 inches out from the base of the outer covering and staked to the ground with wooden pegs. During winter, he could pile snow or earth onto this skirt, creating an insulating barrier that prevented wind from blowing under the teepee's edge. The skirt also prevented moisture from splashing up onto the main covering during rain. Windbreaks were another addition. He constructed low walls using stacked sod on the windward side of the teepee, positioned 10 feet out from the structure. These walls deflected the strongest winds up and over the teepee rather than allowing them to strike the covering directly. The wind breaks also created microclimates around the teepee where he could store firewood under tarps, keeping it dry and accessible. Inside, he cut narrow observation slits through the hide covering at strategic positions, similar to the gun ports he had seen in defensive cabins. The slits were barely visible from outside, but allowed him to observe approaching people or animals without exposing himself. He could cover them from inside using small hide flaps when not in use. The smoke flap controls received special attention. Standard designs used exterior poles to adjust the flaps, requiring someone to go outside in any weather. Gareth rigged an interior control system using ropes that ran from the smoke flap poles down to cleats mounted on the lodge poles at shoulder height. He could adjust ventilation without leaving the shelter, a significant advantage during storms or extreme cold. His final addition was a simple but effective security measure. He buried supplies in sealed containers at marked locations within 50 yards of the teepee, creating emergency caches that couldn't be stolen if the teepee itself was compromised. The cache locations were memorized, not written down, marked only by subtle rock arrangements that would mean nothing to anyone else. December of 1866 brought the moment Gareth had been working toward for nearly 2 years. He rode to Fort Pierre and sent a carefully worded letter to Bronwyn Pritchard in St. Louis. They had been married by proxy in October, a practical arrangement facilitated through letters and a lawyer. She was a widow with a young daughter seeking a new start. He was a frontiersman who needed a family to justify the shelter he had built. The arrangement was more pragmatic than romantic, but the letters they had exchanged suggested compatibility and mutual respect. Bronwyn arrived at Fort Pierre in mid-December with 7-year-old Rhiannon. Gareth met them with a wagon and supplies for the 3-day journey to his claim. He watched Bronwyn's face carefully as they approached the teepee for the first time, trying to gauge her reaction. She said nothing initially, just studied the structure with an expression he couldn't read. Rhiannon showed no such restraint. She thought the teepee looked like something from a storybook and immediately wanted to explore inside. The interior seemed to satisfy Bronwyn more than the exterior. She examined the fire pit, the sleeping arrangements, the storage systems, the food supplies Gareth had accumulated. She tested the door's security, checked the stability of the lodge poles, and ran her hand along the canvas liner. Finally, she turned to Gareth and asked a single practical question. Would it keep them warm through winter? He told her honestly that he believed it would, but that they would find out together. The settlement's reaction was less measured. Word spread quickly that the Welshman trapper had brought a wife and child to live in an Indian teepee. Within a week, 3 separate families made the journey to see for themselves. The visitors were uniformly skeptical. A teepee might work for savages who didn't know better, but no civilized family should be living in animal hide when proper cabins could be built. Thomas Morrison, whose cabin was the closest to Gareth's claim, was particularly vocal. He had a wife and 3 children living in a 2-room log structure he had built the previous year. He stood outside Gareth's teepee and called it a disgrace. No white child should be raised in savage conditions. If Gareth couldn't provide proper housing, Morrison suggested the community should intervene for the child's welfare. Gareth listened without responding to the criticisms. He had expected them. The frontier had rigid ideas about civilization and propriety, and living in indigenous-style housing violated those standards regardless of engineering merit. He knew no amount of explanation would convince people who viewed the situation through cultural prejudice rather than practical assessment. Bronwyn proved to be his unexpected defender. When Margaret Morrison made a comment about poor Rhiannon's suffering in primitive conditions, Bronwyn smiled coldly and invited the Morrisons inside. She showed them the warm interior, the organized living space, the substantial food stores. She pointed out that Rhiannon was clean, well-fed, and comfortable. Then she asked Margaret how much firewood the Morrison cabin required per day to maintain livable temperature. The answer was substantially more than what Gareth's teepee consumed. The Morrisons left without further comment, but the community judgment had been rendered. Gareth Llewellyn had gone native. His family would suffer for his poor decisions. Winter would prove them right. January of 1867 tested the teepee through. Normal winter conditions. Temperatures dropped into the single digits and teens, cold enough to require consistent fire maintenance, but not extreme enough to threaten survival. Gareth established routines that kept the teepee functioning efficiently. He woke twice each night to add wood to the fire, maintaining a low burn that provided steady heat without consuming fuel wastefully. Bronwyn adapted to teepee life with practical efficiency. She organized the interior space, creating designated areas for cooking, sleeping, and daily activities. She taught Rhiannon to respect the fire pit's boundaries and to move carefully around the lodge poles. The confined space required discipline and awareness, but it also created intimacy. The family lived in close proximity, sharing warmth and space in ways that felt natural rather than restrictive. The teepee's performance exceeded Gareth's expectations in several ways. The canvas liner system worked exactly as designed, creating an insulating barrier that trapped warm air while venting cold. The smoke management proved remarkably effective. Even when wind shifted direction rapidly, the adjustable smoke flaps allowed Gareth to maintain proper ventilation without filling the interior with smoke. Fuel consumption was notably lower than cabin heating would require. The teepee's smaller volume and superior insulation meant a modest fire provided adequate warmth. Gareth estimated he was using approximately one-third the firewood that the Morrison cabin required for similar comfort. That efficiency meant less time spent cutting and hauling wood, more time available for other work. Moisture management was another advantage he hadn't fully anticipated. In log cabins, condensation from breathing and cooking accumulated on cold interior walls, creating dampness that led to mold and persistent cold. The teepee's design prevented this. Warm, moist air rose naturally to the smoke hole and vented outside. The canvas liner remained dry, the sleeping furs stayed fresh, and the air quality inside remained good even during extended periods when ductor opening was minimal. Rhiannon thrived. She spent her days learning from Bronwyn, playing with simple toys Gareth carved from wood, and listening to stories by firelight. The teepee's central fire created a focal point for family life that felt more cohesive than the separated spaces of cabin living. The child showed no signs of suffering from her living conditions. Other settlers continued watching with skepticism. Several families made excuses to visit during January, ostensibly for social calls, but clearly checking on the family's welfare. They found Gareth, Bronwyn, and Rhiannon healthy and comfortable. The visitors said little, but their expressions conveyed continued doubt. Normal winter weather proved nothing. The real test would come when serious cold arrived. Gareth made small adjustments based on January's experience. He added extra grass insulation under the sleeping areas. He repositioned one storage platform to improve air circulation. He adjusted the smoke flap control ropes to make ventilation changes smoother. These refinements improved an already functional system. By the end of January, the teepee had proven itself capable of handling moderate winter conditions. But Gareth knew from his years on the frontier that Dakota Territory winters saved their worst for late in the season. February and March could bring cold that made January seem mild. The real validation would come when extreme weather tested every element of his engineering. The first week of March brought unusual weather patterns. The normal late winter moderation didn't arrive. Instead, high pressure settled over the northern plains, creating conditions that drove temperatures into ranges that killed livestock and tested every structure. The sky turned a hard, pale blue that seemed frozen solid. The air became still, without even wind to provide the illusion of movement. Gareth recognized the signs from his years in the territory. This wasn't normal cold. This was the kind of Arctic outbreak that came once or twice a decade, pushing temperatures to levels where exposed skin froze in minutes and breathing became painful. He checked his supplies methodically. Firewood was stacked inside the teepee, enough for 5 days without going outside. Food stores were adequate. Water containers were full. He had prepared for this possibility. The thermometer he kept mounted on a pole outside the teepee began dropping on March 7th. 30 degrees at midday, 20 degrees by sunset, 10 degrees at midnight. The temperature fell steadily, each hour colder than the last. Gareth added wood to the fire more frequently, maintaining a larger burn than normal. The teepee's interior stayed warm, but he could feel the increasing intensity of cold pressing against the hide covering. Other families in the settlement were struggling. Gareth could see the smoke from their chimneys, thick columns that indicated fires burning at maximum intensity. The Morrison cabin, visible from his elevated position, had smoke pouring from its chimney in a gray plume that spoke of desperate fuel consumption. They were burning everything they could to stay warm. On March 8th, the temperature reached -20 degrees. Gareth had experienced cold like this before, the winter Owen died. He remembered how inadequate the cabin had been, how the cold had penetrated despite fire and walls. Inside the teepee, the temperature hovered around 45 degrees, cool enough to require warm clothing, but warm enough to sustain life comfortably. The engineering was holding. Bronwyn showed no fear, but Gareth could see her awareness of the danger. She kept Rhiannon close, maintaining the child's normal routines while watching the fire carefully. They spoke little, conserving energy and heat. The teepee created a cocoon of survivable warmth, while outside, the world became increasingly hostile to life. March 9th brought the peak. The thermometer showed -40 degrees at dawn. By noon, it had fallen further. -45, -50. The cold became almost abstract, temperatures so extreme they seemed unreal. Gareth added wood to the fire every 30 minutes, maintaining flames that provided steady heat without creating dangerous overheating. The smoke flap controls worked perfectly, venting smoke while retaining warmth. Night fell early. Gareth checked the thermometer one final time as twilight faded. -54 degrees Fahrenheit. He went back inside the teepee, secured the door, and settled his family for the night that would either validate everything he had built or prove his critics tragically correct. Inside the teepee, Gareth maintained the fire with methodical precision. The flames rose steadily from the stone-lined pit, consuming the dry wood he had stored weeks earlier. The heat radiated outward and upward, following the conical shape of the structure. The canvas liner trapped this warmth in the living space, while the gap between liner and outer hide created the convective loop that pulled cold air up and out through the smoke hole. The temperature inside the teepee stabilized around 40 degrees. Cold enough that breath formed visible clouds, but warm enough that the cold wasn't dangerous. Gareth, Bronwyn, and Rhiannon sat wrapped in buffalo robes near the fire, comfortable despite the killing cold, less than 2 inches away on the other side of the hide covering. The insulation system was working exactly as designed. Outside, the wind had died completely. The air was too cold to move. Frost formed on every surface in crystalline patterns that caught starlight. The thermometer's mercury column had contracted to its lowest mark and stopped. -54 degrees was beyond the instrument's measuring capacity, but Gareth knew the temperature had stabilized somewhere in that range. He had seen cold like this only once before, the night Owen died. He listened to the sounds of the night, the fires crackling, Bronwyn's steady breathing, Rhiannon's occasional shifting under her furs. The teepee itself made small noises as materials contracted in the cold. The lodge poles creaked minutely. The hide covering made soft sounds as temperature differentials created minor movements, but there were no sounds of structural stress, no indications of failure. Around midnight, Rhiannon fell asleep. Bronwyn followed an hour later, her trust in Gareth's engineering allowing her to rest despite the extreme conditions. Gareth remained awake, not from worry, but from awareness. This was the test he had been preparing for since Owen's death. Every decision about materials, every calculation of insulation values, every detail of construction had been aimed at surviving exactly this situation. He added wood to the fire every 45 minutes through the night, maintaining consistent heat output without allowing the fire to burn too large. The fuel consumption was moderate, sustainable, through multiple days of extreme cold, if necessary. The teepee's small interior volume and excellent insulation made heating efficient in a way that large cabin spaces could never match. The smoke ventilation continued working flawlessly. The adjustable flaps allowed him to fine-tune the smoke hole opening based on fire size and draft conditions. Smoke rose in a straight column and exited cleanly. No accumulation occurred inside. The air remained breathable and clear. In the darkest hours before dawn, Gareth allowed himself a moment of reflection. Owen had died in a cabin that frontier wisdom considered proper shelter. Gareth's family was surviving extreme cold in a structure that same wisdom dismissed as primitive. The irony was sharp. Indigenous peoples had developed engineering solutions superior to European construction for specific conditions, but prejudice prevented most settlers from recognizing that truth. Dawn came slowly on March 10, 1867. The sky lightened from black to deep blue to pale gray. Gareth checked the fire one final time, added fresh wood, and waited for enough light to assess the world outside. Gareth opened the teepee door carefully. The leather hinges were stiff from cold, but functional. The first breath of outside air burned his lungs. He stepped out onto snow that crunched under his boots with a sound like breaking glass. The world was utterly still. No wind, no bird sounds. Nothing moved in the frozen landscape. The thermometer still read its minimum measurement, but the mercury column had risen slightly. -48 degrees, perhaps -45. Still dangerously cold, but the worst had passed. Gareth scanned the valley where other homesteads were scattered. Smoke rose from several chimneys, thin columns in the still air. But from the Morrison cabin, no smoke showed. He stood looking at that silent chimney for several minutes, hoping to see smoke appear. Nothing changed. The absence of smoke from a chimney on a morning this cold meant only one thing. Either the family had abandoned the cabin, which was unlikely in these conditions, or they hadn't survived the night. Two other cabins also showed no smoke. The Hendricks place, a mile north. The Weber cabin to the east. 3 families, possibly 12 to 15 people total, with no signs of life on a morning when fires should be burning at maximum intensity. Gareth felt the familiar weight of grief settling over him. He had known this cold would kill. He had hoped his neighbors would survive, but frontier cabins weren't designed for Arctic conditions. He went back inside the teepee. Bronwyn was awake, heating water for morning coffee. Rhiannon still slept under her furs. The interior was warm, the air clear, everything functioning as designed. The contrast between his family's safety and the probable tragedy in the valley was stark. By mid-morning, a rider came from the settlement center. Jacob Thornton, one of the few men who had never openly mocked Gareth's housing choice, looked exhausted and grim. He confirmed what Gareth had feared. The Morrison family was dead, frozen in their cabin despite a fire that had apparently burned through the night. The chimney had filled with ice from condensation, blocking the smoke. They had suffocated from smoke accumulation while simultaneously freezing. The Hendricks family had survived but suffered severe frostbite. They had abandoned their cabin during the night and taken shelter in their barn with their livestock, using animal body heat to stay alive. The Weber family was gone entirely. Their cabin had been found empty, and tracks leading away suggested they had tried to reach another homestead. No one had found them yet. Thornton looked at Gareth's teepee with new understanding. He asked how the night had been. Gareth answered truthfully, uncomfortable but safe. The teepee had maintained livable temperature throughout. His family was unharmed. Thornton nodded slowly. processing this information against everything he had assumed about proper frontier shelter. News spread through the surviving families within hours. The Welshman and his family had weathered the killing cold in their Indian tipi, while good Christian families froze in proper cabins. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Neither were the implications about which engineering approach was actually superior for extreme conditions. Gareth spent the days following the crisis helping survivors. He shared firewood with families whose supplies had been exhausted during the extreme cold. He offered shelter in his teepee to the Hendricks family while they recovered from frostbite, though they politely declined. He helped bury the Morrisons in ground that required pickaxes to penetrate. The community's attitude toward him shifted, but not dramatically. There were no apologies for the mockery. No one admitted they had been wrong about teepee construction. Instead, a quiet acknowledgement settled over the settlement. Gareth Llewellyn had built something that worked. The proof was undeniable. His family was alive and healthy while others had died in structures considered superior. Thomas Morrison's oldest son, Peter, approached Gareth in late March. He was 17, now the head of his remaining family, after losing both parents and a younger sister to the cold. He asked Gareth direct questions about tipi construction. How much did materials cost? How long did building take? Could it be done by someone without experience? Gareth answered every question honestly. He didn't promote teepees as superior to all cabin construction. He explained that they were better for specific situations, particularly for people living in mobile or semi-permanent conditions, or in areas where extreme cold was common. For permanent settlement with access to good building materials, cabins had advantages. But for frontier survival, typists offered benefits that most settlers didn't understand. Other men began asking similar questions, always quietly, often approaching Gareth when others weren't around. The inquiries had a pattern. Men would start by asking about some minor aspect of construction, testing whether Gareth would share information freely or guard his knowledge. When they found him willing to explain anything, the questions became more detailed and specific. By April, 3 families had begun building teepees. They framed the construction as temporary summer shelters for hunting camps or secondary structures for storage. No one admitted they were building winter housing. Frontier pride required maintaining the fiction that log cabins remained the proper choice for civilized people. But the engineering spoke for itself. Gareth watched these construction efforts with mixed feelings. He was glad his knowledge could help others survive, but each new teepee reminded him of Owen's death, the tragedy that had started this entire journey. The validation was bittersweet. People were learning, but the lessons had cost lives. Bronwyn understood his complicated emotions. She had her own perspective on the situation, shaped by being the outsider who had arrived after the prejudices were already established. She told Gareth that he had done something remarkable, not by building a superior shelter, but by being willing to learn from people the frontier considered inferior. That openness to knowledge, regardless of source, was rare and valuable. Summer came, and with it, the normal rhythms of frontier life. Crops were planted, animals were tended. The extreme cold became a memory, though the graves remained as permanent reminders. Gareth continued trapping and hunting, providing for his family while quietly improving his teepee based on a full winter's experience. The winter of 1867 through 68 saw a quiet transformation across the scattered homesteads of southeastern Dakota Territory. 5 families now maintained teepees alongside their log cabins, using the hide structures as primary winter housing while keeping cabins for storage and summer use. No one called them teepees in public conversation. They were referred to as winter lodges or temporary shelters, linguistic gymnastics that preserved pride while embracing practical engineering. Gareth became an informal consultant, visiting homesteads to advise on construction details. He shared his processing techniques for Elk-Hide, explained the physics of the double-wall liner system, and demonstrated proper smoke flap adjustment. He never charged for this knowledge. Survival information shouldn't be commodified when sharing it freely could save lives. The adaptations other families made interested him. Some combined teepee design with cabin construction techniques, creating hybrid structures that used hide coverings over log frameworks. Others built smaller teepees than gareths, optimizing for couples rather than families. One family built an oversized tipi that could house two families, creating a communal living space during extreme cold. By 1870, the scattered settlement had developed a distinct winter survival pattern. Families maintained permanent cabins for warm weather living, but had access to hide shelters for cold weather efficiency. The arrangement wasn't universal. Some settlers refused to adopt indigenous technology regardless of demonstrated benefits. But enough families made the transition that teepee construction became an accepted, if not openly celebrated, element of regional frontier culture. Gareth's role evolved from innovator to teacher. Young men preparing to establish their own homesteads sought his guidance on shelter construction. He taught them not just the mechanics of building teepees, but the principles behind the design. Understanding why something worked was more valuable than knowing how to build it. With understanding came the ability to adapt and improve. The broader frontier community beyond Dakota territory remained largely ignorant of these developments. Teepees were Indian shelters, primitive and inferior. That prejudice continued in most areas. But in the specific region where extreme cold killed regularly, where survival trumped pride, knowledge spread organically among people who needed it. Gareth and Bronwyn had two more children, sons born in 1868 and 1870. The teepee housed the growing family comfortably, though Gareth eventually built a second structure to provide more space. The family's success demonstrated that indigenous housing technology could support permanent settlement when properly implemented. Rhiannon grew up with teepee living as normal. She learned the engineering principles from her father, understood the cultural complexities from her mother, and developed a perspective that bridged two worlds. By age 12, she could construct a functional teepee working alone, a skill that made her unusual among frontier children, but equipped her with knowledge that would serve her entire life. Gareth Llewellyn died on November 3, 1889, at age 54. He passed quietly in his sleep in the ranch house he and Bronwyn had built in eastern Wyoming Territory, far from the Dakota settlement where he had first constructed his Elk-Hide Tipi. His death was unremarkable by frontier standards, mourned by family and a few close friends, but noted by no newspaper or historical record. He left behind a wife, 3 grown children, and a modest ranch that provided comfortable living. His obituary, published in the local Wyoming newspaper, identified him as a successful rancher and former trapper. It made no mention of teepee construction or frontier innovation. To the wider world, Gareth Llewellyn was simply another settler who had worked hard and lived respectably. His engineering achievements went unrecorded in official histories. But Rhiannon remembered. She was 30 years old when her father died, married to a school teacher and living in Montana Territory. She had spent her childhood winters in the teepee her father built, warm and safe, while other families struggled in inadequate cabins. Those memories shaped her understanding of innovation and cultural learning in ways that influenced her entire life. She told her own children about their grandfather's willingness to learn from indigenous engineering despite community mockery. She explained how he had studied teepee construction with the same seriousness that educated men applied to formal architecture. She described the night at -54 degrees when the teepee's engineering saved their lives, while neighbors died in supposedly superior housing. In the mountains and plains of Montana and Dakota, scattered teepees continued standing through the 1890s and into the early 20th century. Some were still occupied by the families Gareth had taught. Others had been abandoned as settlements grew and permanent construction became standard. But the structures remained, weathered hide and aging poles that testified to engineering principles that transcended cultural prejudice. The specific techniques Gareth had developed spread beyond the families he had personally instructed. Trappers and hunters adopted elements of his design. Army scouts built tipis using his methods. The knowledge moved through frontier communities in informal networks that carried all practical survival information, valued for its effectiveness. Historians would later recognize that frontier innovation often came from cultural synthesis rather than pure European tradition. Settlers who survived were frequently those willing to learn from indigenous peoples whose engineering had been refined through generations. Gareth Llewellyn was one of thousands who made this choice, though most went unrecorded. The tipi itself would largely disappear from white frontier use as permanent settlement replaced mobile living. But the principle Gareth demonstrated remained valuable. Good engineering was good engineering regardless of its cultural origin. Survival required setting aside prejudice in favor of what actually worked. The story of a Welsh trapper who built an Elk-Hide Tipi and saved his family at -54 degrees illustrates a truth about frontier development. Progress wasn't linear movement from primitive to advanced. It was complex synthesis of multiple knowledge systems, with innovation coming from unexpected combinations of traditional wisdom and practical necessity.